In 1931, in the middle of the Great Depression, a group of 500 men and women marched on a grocery store in Minneapolis and looted it bare in under 30 minutes. The police arrived and arrested several people. The next day, 1,000 people came back and looted 3 more stores. The National Guard was called, and the governor of Minnesota said something afterward that every American living in 2026 should hear. He said they were not criminals, they were hungry, and he was right. Hungry people do not behave like desperate people. Desperate people calculate. Desperate people make trade-offs. Desperate people tighten their belts. Hungry people are past calculation. Hunger bypasses the part of the brain that weighs consequences because the body has declared an emergency that overrides every social contract, every legal norm, every cultural expectation of civility. And right now in 2026, the United States Department of Agriculture reports that 47.9 million Americans are living in food-insecure households. That is not 47.9 million people who are mildly inconvenienced by grocery prices. That is 47.9 million people for whom the question of whether they will eat today, or eat enough today, or eat something nutritious today, is an open question with no guaranteed answer. 1 in every 7 Americans. And that number was calculated before the Iran war closed the Strait of Hormuz, before fertilizer prices rose 40% in a single month, before diesel jumped from $3.89 to $5.37, before gasoline crossed $4, before SNAP benefits were suspended during the government shutdown, and before Congress passed $187 billion in SNAP cuts that the Food Research and Action Center called the most devastating cuts to the program in its history. Every one of those events makes the 47.9 million number larger. And every one of those events moves the 47.9 million closer to the line where food insecurity becomes hunger, and hunger becomes action. And people have no idea what hungry Americans are capable of. Because America has not been truly hungry since the 1930s. And the country has collectively forgotten what that looks like. 90% of shoplifters now say they steal because of economic hardship, and retail theft has hit the highest level ever recorded. USA Today reported that 90% of recent shoplifters said they steal because of economic hardship. Not for thrills, not for addiction, not for resale, because they cannot afford to buy what they need. 34% said prices have become unaffordable. 30% said they steal to make ends meet. 27% said they steal to save money on necessities. And the National Retail Federation documented that combined losses from shoplifting, employee theft, and organized retail crime totaled approximately $112 billion in 2023, the highest retail shrink ever recorded in the United States. By 2026, shoplifting alone could cost retailers over $150 billion, according to Capital One Shopping. Shoplifting incidents rose 15% year-over-year, with over 1.15 million reported incidents in 2023 alone, the highest since 2019. Chicago saw a 46% increase in reported shoplifting incidents from January to October 2024 compared to 2023. Organized retail crime incidents have increased 27% since 2020. And the items being stolen are not luxury goods, they are not electronics. They are not designer handbags. Increasingly, they are food, baby formula, hygiene products, and over-the-counter medication. The products that are locked behind plexiglass at your local Walgreens and CVS are not locked up because of organized crime rings targeting them for resale. They are locked up because ordinary Americans cannot afford to buy them at the listed price. And when the next wave of food price increases arrives in June, July, and August, as the fertilizer disruption and diesel cost cascade work through the supply chain, the $150 billion in retail theft will look like a rounding error compared to what is coming. Because the grocery store is the front line of the affordability crisis. It is where the abstract economic data becomes physical, where the inflation rate stops being a number and becomes a mother staring at a package of chicken that costs $3 more than it did 6 months ago and deciding whether to put it back. And when enough mothers put it back enough times, and the food bank that is supposed to fill the gap is already overwhelmed, and the SNAP benefits that were supposed to supplement the budget have been cut by $187 billion. The calculation changes. The trade-off between paying and not paying shifts. And the grocery store discovers what 47.9 million food-insecure Americans look like when the social contract that was keeping them inside the rules no longer provides enough food to justify following those rules. And the violence that accompanies retail theft is escalating in parallel with the theft itself. Reports document that customers have become violent and aggressive toward employees, at times even assaulting them. And that retail theft is a common trigger linked to this behavior. Employees at grocery chains in urban areas describe an environment where confronting a shoplifter is no longer a policy decision, but a safety calculation. Do you risk your physical safety to prevent the loss of a $12 package of steak? Most companies now tell their employees not to intervene because the liability from an employee injury exceeds the cost of the stolen merchandise, which means the stores are essentially undefended. The locked plexiglass cases slow down theft but do not prevent it. The security guards deter casual theft but cannot stop a group that enters with intent. And the self-checkout lanes that were supposed to reduce labor costs have become the single largest vulnerability in the retail loss prevention system because the technology was designed for convenience, not security. 47% of retail shrink in stores with self-checkout occurs at the self-checkout lane. And when the food price surge arrives in June and July, the incentive to undercount, miscount, or simply walk out will intensify for exactly the population that is already on the edge of food insecurity. The stores will respond by locking more products behind plexiglass, by reducing hours, by closing locations in neighborhoods where the theft exceeds the profit margin. And those closures will create food deserts in communities that were already underserved, pushing more families toward food banks that are already overwhelmed, pushing more families toward desperation, pushing more families past the line where the social contract holds. When SNAP benefits stopped during a government shutdown, food banks were overwhelmed in 72 hours, and that was before any of this. During the 2025 government shutdown that began on October 1st, SNAP disbursements ceased on November 1st. 42 million Americans who depend on SNAP for a portion of their food budget were told that the benefits they rely on to feed their families would not be deposited. Federal litigation was filed immediately. Governors in multiple states took emergency action. At least 25 states announced that SNAP benefits would not be paid if the shutdown continued. The administration declined to use $6 billion in USDA reserve funds to maintain payments. And within 72 hours, food banks across the country reported demand surges that exceeded their capacity. Feeding America, the largest domestic hunger relief organization in the United States, reported that 1 in 7 Americans it serves is a senior citizen. Food banks that were already operating at 120 to 140% of their pre-pandemic baseline capacity were suddenly asked to absorb millions of additional households. Lines stretched around buildings, shelves emptied, volunteers were overwhelmed. And that was a temporary disruption. The shutdown eventually ended. The benefits were restored, the system snapped back. Now imagine what happens when the disruption is not temporary. The $187 billion in SNAP cuts that Congress passed through H.R. 1 are not a temporary suspension. They are a permanent structural reduction that will cut benefits by approximately $100 per month for roughly 600. Low-income households. Expand work requirements to adults aged 55 to 64 for the first time. Eliminate the internet deduction from the shelter allowance. And increase state administrative cost sharing from 50 to 75%. When the 2025 shutdown stopped SNAP for weeks, food banks nearly collapsed under the demand. The SNAP cuts enacted in H.R. 1 will reduce benefits permanently for years. And the food bank system that could barely handle a weeks-long disruption will be asked to absorb a decade-long structural reduction in federal food assistance that begins during a war-driven food price surge that is already pushing grocery costs up 5 to 10% on top of a cumulative 36% increase since 2014. The food banks are the last line of defense. And the last line of defense was already cracking before the Iran war added 40% fertilizer cost increases and $5.37 diesel to the equation. Feeding America reported that demand at food banks nationwide has surged to levels that exceed the capacity of many local pantries. 1 in 7 Americans served by Feeding America's network is a senior citizen. The demographic most likely to have a fixed income that cannot absorb a 5 to 10% food price increase. Food banks in the South and the Midwest, regions where food insecurity rates are historically highest, have reported reducing per-household distributions to stretch supply across more families. And food donations from retailers and manufacturers are declining because the same supply chain pressures that are raising consumer prices are reducing the surplus inventory that companies used to donate. When a grocery store's shelves are tight, the overage that would normally go to a food bank does not exist. When a manufacturer is paying 40% more for inputs, the products that did not meet retail specifications and would normally be redirected to charitable channels are instead being sold through discount outlets to recover cost. The donation pipeline that feeds the food banks is drying up at the exact moment that the demand pipeline is flooding in. And the volunteers who staff those food banks are themselves aging, retiring, and dealing with the same cost of living pressures that are driving the people they serve to seek help. The entire system, from federal funding to state administration to local distribution to volunteer labor, is under simultaneous strain from every direction. And the strain is going to intensify every month between now and August as the war-driven price increases work through the supply chain and the snap cuts begin to take effect. History shows exactly what happens when a population hits the hunger threshold, and America is not immune. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published a comprehensive analysis of the link between food insecurity and conflict. Their research documented that the 2007-2008 global food price crisis led to social unrest in at least 40 low- and middle-income countries in what has been termed the silent tsunami. By the summer of 2022, more than 20 countries were facing protests and riots related at least in part to high food prices following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The pattern is consistent across history, across cultures, and across political systems. When food prices cross a threshold that a sufficient percentage of the population cannot afford, social order degrades. Not in theory, in documented, repeated historical fact. And the assumption that America is immune to this pattern because it is wealthy, because it is stable, because it has institutions, because it has a food system that produces enough calories, is an assumption that has never been tested at the scale of stress that is currently building. The last time American food insecurity approached crisis levels was during the Great Depression, when unemployment reached 25% and bread lines stretched for blocks in every major city. The federal response to that crisis was the creation of the Food Stamp Program, the precursor to SNAP, which was designed specifically to prevent the social instability that hunger had produced. SNAP was not created as a welfare program. It was created as a national security program. Its purpose was to ensure that hungry Americans would not do what hungry people in every other country in history have done when the food system failed them. And Congress just cut that program by $187 billion. During a war-driven food price surge, while 47.9 million Americans are already food insecure, while food banks are already at capacity, while retail theft is already at $150 billion and climbing, while 1 in 3 Americans has already skipped a meal in the past year, while SNAP benefits were already suspended during a shutdown that demonstrated exactly how fragile the system is. The safety net that was specifically designed to prevent hunger-driven instability is being dismantled at the exact moment that every condition for hunger-driven instability is present. And the people dismantling it have government salaries, government health care, government pensions, and a cafeteria in the Capitol building that is subsidized by taxpayer funds. They will not miss a meal. They will not stand in a food bank line. They will not stare at a grocery receipt and decide between chicken and rent. And they will not be present when the consequences of their vote arrive in the communities that depended on the program they cut. And the historical record is unambiguous about what those consequences look like. In 1917, food riots broke out in New York City when the price of onions, potatoes, and chicken doubled within weeks. Women overturned pushcarts and attacked vendors in the streets of the Lower East Side. Police were called to disperse crowds of hundreds. In 1943, despite wartime rationing keeping prices stable, a rumor of meat shortages in Detroit triggered a run on butcher shops that devolved into physical confrontations. In 1992, during the Los Angeles riots, the first buildings targeted for looting after the initial unrest were grocery stores and liquor stores, not luxury retailers. When civil order breaks, food is the first target because food is the first need. In 2020, during the pandemic's initial weeks, American consumers stripped grocery shelves bare within 48 hours of the first lockdown announcements. That was not hunger, that was fear of hunger. And the fear alone was sufficient to empty every store in the country of essentials. When actual hunger arrives, the behavior will be qualitatively different from the fear-driven hoarding of 2020, because hoarding is an act of preparation. Hunger is an act of desperation, and desperation does not wait in line, does not compare prices, does not read nutrition labels, does not check the expiration date, does not care that the security camera is recording. Panic buying is not irrational, and it is already happening in countries hit harder by the Hormuz crisis. Bangladesh is experiencing daily robberies at gas stations and fuel trucks as people stockpile fuel. Gas station managers have been beaten, some have been killed. The Philippines declared a state of emergency on March 24th. Myanmar restricted private vehicle use to alternate days. Nepal is filling only half of consumers' cooking gas cylinders. Australia's Prime Minister went on national television to urge citizens to take public transportation and not to hoard fuel. India imposed export duties on diesel and aviation fuel to keep domestic supplies from being shipped abroad. And in every one of these countries, the crisis began the same way. It began with a price increase, then it became a shortage. Then it became panic buying. Then the panic buying created an actual shortage that would not have existed if the panic had not occurred. The feedback loop between fear and scarcity is the most dangerous economic mechanism that exists because it is self-fulfilling. The fear of shortage creates hoarding, hoarding creates shortage. Shortage confirms the fear, and the loop accelerates until supply chains break or governments intervene with rationing. And America is not immune to this loop. The toilet paper panic of March 2020 demonstrated that American consumers will hoard essential goods the moment they perceive a supply threat, regardless of whether the actual supply is sufficient. The Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack in May 2021 demonstrated that American consumers will drain gas stations bare within 48 hours of a perceived fuel disruption, even when the disruption is regional and temporary. The baby formula shortage of 2022 demonstrated that American consumers will clear shelves of a critical product the moment news coverage creates awareness of limited supply, even in stores where the supply was adequate before the panic began. Each of these events was localized or temporary. The Iran war is neither. The Hormuz crisis is global, and it is now in its 9th week with no resolution. The fertilizer disruption is seasonal and irreversible for this year's crop. The snap cuts are structural and permanent. The diesel price increase is sustained and shows no sign of returning to pre-war levels. Every precondition for a panic buying event in the American food system is present. And the only thing preventing it from igniting is the fact that American grocery shelves still look normal. For now, but behind those shelves, the inventory is 72 hours deep. The supply chain is running on diesel that costs 38% more than it did 2 months ago. The fertilizer that was supposed to feed this year's crop did not arrive on time or arrived at 40% higher cost. And the federal food assistance program that feeds 42 million Americans has just been cut by $187 billion, while simultaneously being disrupted by a government shutdown that demonstrated it could be turned off with a political standoff. The shelves look normal, the system behind the shelves does not. And the American food system is uniquely vulnerable to a panic event because of a structural characteristic that no other major economy shares. America's food supply chain is optimized for efficiency, not resilience. The just-in-time inventory model that grocery retailers adopted in the 1990s and 2000s eliminated warehouse stockpiles in favor of continuous delivery from distribution centers. A modern American grocery store carries approximately 30,000 to 40,000 unique products on its shelves. But the volume of any single product on that shelf is calibrated to sell through in 24 to 72 hours before the next delivery replenishes it. There is no back room full of extra inventory. There is no warehouse behind the store. There is a truck that comes on schedule, and if that truck does not come, or comes with a partial load because the distribution center ran short, or arrives 2 days late because the carrier could not afford the diesel to run the route on time. The shelf stays empty until the next delivery cycle. And the consumer who sees an empty shelf does not wait for the next cycle. The consumer buys more of whatever is still available, which empties adjacent shelves, which triggers the panic response in every other consumer who walks in and sees the gaps, which accelerates the buying, which empties more shelves, which creates the visual evidence of shortage that was not a shortage until the panic made it one. This feedback loop is the most dangerous economic mechanism in the American food system, and it requires exactly one triggering event to activate: a regional diesel shortage, a major trucking company going bankrupt, a news broadcast showing empty shelves in one market that causes consumers in every other market to preemptively buy, a SNAP payment that does not arrive on schedule. Any of these triggers, all of which are more probable today than at any point since 2020, could start the loop. And once the loop starts, it does not stop until the supply chain catches up or the government intervenes with rationing. And the current government has demonstrated through the shutdown, through the SNAP cuts, through the failure to refill the SBR, that intervention is not its default response. Children go hungry first, and what happens to American parents when their children cannot eat is something no government wants to face. The USDA Food Security Report documented that 13.5 million children lived in food-insecure households in the most recent data. 13.5 million children in the United States of America, in a country that produces more food than any nation on earth except China and India. And the Center for American Progress documented that hungry children have higher rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and chronic disease. Hungry children perform worse in school. Hungry children are hospitalized more frequently. Hungry children develop more slowly and reach developmental milestones later than their food-secure peers. And the behavioral reality of childhood hunger is that children do not go hungry in isolation. Parents go hungry first. Every parent in America who has faced food insecurity knows the ritual. You feed the children first, you eat whatever is left. If there is nothing left, you do not eat, and you tell the children you are not hungry. That ritual works for days, it works for weeks, it does not work for months. And when a parent who has been skipping meals to feed their children watches, SNAP benefits get cut. Watches grocery prices climb 5 to 10% on top of a 36% cumulative increase. Watches the food bank line stretch around the block with a 2-hour wait. And comes home with a bag that has less food in it than the children need. Something breaks. Not economically, psychologically. The parent who has been holding the system together through sheer willpower and sacrifice reaches the point where the system can no longer be held together by any amount of effort. And what happens next is what happened in Minneapolis in 1931. What happened in 40 countries during the 2007-2008 food crisis. What happened in 20 countries in 2022. What happened in Bangladesh last month. What happens everywhere in every era in every culture when parents cannot feed their children. They stop following rules that were designed for a world where following the rules kept their children fed. And no amount of police presence, no amount of surveillance, no amount of locked plexiglass cases, and no amount of political rhetoric about personal responsibility will change the behavior of a parent whose child went to bed hungry last night and will go to bed hungry tonight unless something changes before dinner. And the 47.9 million Americans who are food insecure right now include 13.5 million children. And the $187 billion in SNAP cuts will reduce benefits for the households that feed those children. And the fertilizer shock will reduce the food supply available at any price. And the diesel shock will increase the cost of every calorie that reaches a grocery shelf. And the war that caused all of it has no resolution date. And the ceasefire that was supposed to end it collapsed in 24 hours. And the Strait of Hormuz is still effectively blocked. And the strategic reserves are being drained at a rate that cannot be sustained past summer. And the food banks that are the last line between food insecurity and hunger are already at capacity. And Congress, which has the power to restore the SNAP funding, expand emergency food assistance, and stabilize the food supply chain, just passed a farm bill that the Food Research and Action Center said fails to reverse any of the $187 billion in cuts. Every firewall between food insecurity and hunger has been weakened, defunded, or overwhelmed. Every pressure that pushes families toward the hunger threshold has intensified. And the American public has been told that the economy is strong, that inflation is coming down, and that the ceasefire means the crisis is over. The economy is not strong for the 47.9 million. Inflation is not coming down for the people buying groceries. And the ceasefire collapsed before the ink was dry. You do not want to see what hungry Americans do, because hungry Americans are not a crime statistic. They are not a policy failure, they are not an economic indicator, they are parents. And parents who cannot feed their children are capable of things that no economic model can predict and no institution can contain. And the distance between where America is right now and where that threshold lives is measured in weeks, not years. Share this video with everyone you know because the people who understand what is building will stock their pantry. Support their food bank and contact their representative before August. The people who do not understand will discover it when the shelf is empty and the line is around the block, and the look in their neighbor's eyes tells them that something fundamental has changed.